Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about how that 3D Zelda leak that we talked about a few weeks ago that seems to probably be true really does have so many implications. We've already talked about this, we've already talked about why it's believable, why it seems likely that it's actually going to be happening, but what I want to do is dive even further into this and talk about the wide variety of applications to overall Zelda story and lore and gameplay, because I think while we did touch on some ideas in that prior video, I think there's really a lot more that we can expand on here that is rather interesting. And there's even another element that I would like to consider that might pertain to not just a game that's coming a few years from now, but something that could be happening in the not so distant future. So I think this is going to make for some interesting Zelda conversation about something that I think is probably happening. Now, if you missed that video, I'll put it in the iCard, but basic brief summary here. This leak came from Special Nick of the Xbox Era podcast, who has shown to have a very strong track record, especially with Nintendo rumors, so in my eyes, this is basically an accurate leak, especially considering what we've heard, because it is in line with what's been suggested with interviews, and it does seem to be the direction the Zelda team is headed in. And that direction is this: to make another open-air Zelda game with the same engine, but with enhancements. That's what we've heard from the leak, which makes a lot of sense. Now, to clarify on something, the same engine does not mean it's going to have the same art style, the same world. You can make so many different games with an engine. Look at Unreal Engine. So many different games are made with that, or even look at Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Those Zelda games, which are very different from each other, were made with the same engine. So this does not mean we're getting a Breath of the Wild 3. What it means is that we're going to get another Zelda game that will be open world, that will likely have pretty involved physics, more so than we've already seen, with some really cool abilities that likely have a wide variety of applications, and will be able to explore about the world and do things with a lot of freedom. They're going to continue in this direction and expand on it, which is very predictable. Really, the more surprising part to the leak is cross-dimensional puzzles. Now, two examples are used to explain how this might work. One example is a bull chasing you or something in one realm or dimension, but then upon impact it leads to a change in the realm or dimension you're in. And then another example is you moving water from one realm or dimension to another, which can raise the water level of that room and impact objects in that room. And so from this, I actually believe we can extrapolate a great deal about what could happen in the next Zelda game. I think there's actually a lot of implication here. So one of the big things that comes to mind here, this talk of there being different realms or dimensions, it really does feel a lot like the light world, dark world mechanics we saw from A Link to the Past, or basically what we saw in Lorule in A Link Between Worlds, or even what we saw between the past and future in Ocarina of Time. This idea of there being some kind of light world and dark world is actually very common, and has even been used in other games like Metroid Prime 2, for example. But thinking about the Zelda series, we've seen other things like this, like the Twilight Realm in Twilight Princess. Or perhaps you can even stretch that a little bit and think about how there is the surface of the ocean in the Wind Waker, but then there's also below the surface, where there is a version of Hyrule from a long time ago that you can explore. A small part, but there is something there. Or even in the most recent Tears of the Kingdom, you have the heavens above, but you also have the depths below. There are other realms to explore, and so with this mechanic in mind, cross-dimensional puzzles, it suggests that there's going to be another realm here. Even in the most recent Echoes of Wisdom, there was another realm where we were exploring about different environments. So this idea is prevalent throughout the Zelda series, and with the existence of these cross-dimensional puzzles where something will be happening in one space impacting another, this does call to question this idea that we'll be seeing the return of this very common motif throughout the Zelda series. And so this has massive implications from a gameplay perspective, which we'll be getting into, but also from a story lore perspective. Are we going to get a modern Zelda game that's going to expand upon what we understand of the Dark World or Lorule? Are we going to see a return of one of those realms, or perhaps maybe the Twilight Realm, or is it going to be something entirely new? Let's say hypothetically, and I do not believe this is happening for the record, I think this would be a mistake, I think they should move on to a new era of Zelda with a new art style and a new generation of characters. But let's say they did decide to make a Breath of the Wild 3. They could use this opportunity to introduce an entirely different world to explore that would be a mirror of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. They can still make it feel and look completely different, but maybe it could be an exploration of, say, the Demon Realm. And perhaps this could tie into Demise, the root cause of the great evil that has plagued Hyrule for generations. The Curse of Demise is what has led to what we have seen from Ganondorf. So if they really want to expand upon the story events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that might be a way to do it, or perhaps it could even be an explanation as to why we don't quite understand what's going on with the Triforce in Breath or Tears of the Kingdom. Technically, it does show up in Breath of the Wild very briefly towards the end, but that's it. Maybe they could explain a little bit of that if they were to do this. Now, that's just a hypothetical, I don't actually expect that, but with the introduction of another realm, there's a lot of potential exploration there from a story lore perspective. But something else I'll point out here that I think is worthy of note is that we've seen in the past the Zelda team put out a remaster or something along those lines that kind of sets the stage for the next big game. So, some examples. They put out Wind Waker HD, and that was them testing the hardware for the Wii U as they were developing Breath of the Wild. And revisiting the Wind Waker was a great game to put out before getting to Breath of the Wild, because the Wind Waker was the closest example of the open world experience they were going to be offering in Breath of the Wild. And they did something very similar with Skyward Sword HD. Not that they needed Skyward Sword HD to test out the hardware for the Switch, but putting out Skyward Sword HD before Tears of the Kingdom was a great teaser for the explorations of the sky, because there is a great deal of sky exploration in Skyward Sword, which they certainly expanded on a great deal in Tears of the Kingdom. And so it's likely going to be a few years before we get the next open-air Zelda, but I do expect there will be some sort of ambitious reworking, I would assume some kind of remake, for another Zelda game before that comes out to tide us over and get that Zelda fanbase involved. If you've been following me for a while, you know what I'm talking about. I do think there's a really good chance we're going to get a remake for Ocarina of Time. And so I think this is a very interesting situation, because we're hearing about these cross-dimensional puzzles, perhaps some kind of light world, dark world mechanic, and an Ocarina of Time remake could also be a nice little primer for that as well, because there are a lot of puzzles between the past and the future, and if this is an ambitious remake, they may expand on that. Like one puzzle, for example, you would go into a dungeon as a kid, the Spirit Dungeon, collect an important item, handle things how you can as a kid, but then you come in as an adult with greater height and no longer being able to fit into smaller spaces, but having access to more strength and more items so you can do things in a different way. There were some interesting dynamics there by exploring environments in different times. And so I guess another implication here is that there may be a bit of a pattern of Nintendo continuing to put out reworkings of Zelda games to prime us for the next big new Zelda game, and there's something about that game, a big part to that game, that ties into a big element of the next game. Now, if you've gone this far into the video, let me simply point out that I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos and you haven't subscribed already, I would very much appreciate it. But now honing in on gameplay stuff here. If we're talking about cross-dimensional puzzles, how exactly is that going to work out? Well, an idea that comes to mind to me are portals, because the examples shown, one of them talks about transporting water from one realm to another. How would you do that? Perhaps by having a portal. And an example I didn't bring up in the prior video is, well, the Portal games. The Portal games, you shoot portals, and there's so many really cool puzzles that you can handle in various ways through that, and that honestly feels very Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, being able to shoot or place portals and seeing all the different possible interactions, playing around with the physics to accomplish so many different things. So in the context of an open-air Zelda with the physics involved, having a portal system like what we saw in the Portal games to handle all of these cross-dimensional puzzles could be mind-boggling, but also amazing. But you know, there's another possibility here, and I don't think it would be one or the other necessarily, it could even be both. but we could also see the return of something like the time shift stones, what we saw in Skyward Sword. And so in Skyward Sword, you could actually move around these objects that would transfer the environment that's within a certain radius of these stones to the past. And that had a variety of really cool puzzles as well, and it led to some pretty exciting dungeons in Skyward Sword, some of the best dungeons in the Zelda series. And so just keep that in mind, because there's another bigger point I'll get to that ties into this. But circling back to cross-dimensional puzzles and needing to access objects and interact with objects across realms, an item that I think makes a lot of sense to return with these types of puzzles and abilities in mind is some variation of the hookshot clawshot. This is something that has been retired as of late, but I think it needs to come out of retirement for the next Zelda game, and I think it could actually have a great deal of application. When we look at some of the concept art for Breath of the Wild, they were considering a variation of the clawshot hookshot, but it didn't make it to the final product of the game. For this next open-air Zelda, they may finally get to it, and I think it actually could work out really well. If you already have an ability to, say, lay out portals to connect you to another realm, sure, maybe you can jump through it, but maybe you could also grab something through it, or maybe you're shooting a portal, something very much like Portal to like the ceiling. You can't reach the ceiling otherwise, but you can shoot your claw shot and latch onto something on the other side of that portal, or pull something out depending on what's the bigger object or surface is being grabbed onto. And so we could have this interesting interplay between two different abilities that have a wide variety of application. And I also actually love the idea of them bringing back the hookshot as a way to speed up traversal without breaking level design. So I thought Ascend was a really cool, fun ability, but I also think in practice, maybe it's best as a one-time thing. Because as cool as it was, and as neat as it may have been to skip entire sections to dungeons, I think when you have dungeons where you have this ability that allows you to easily break a lot of the level design put behind the dungeon, it kind of ruins the dungeon. I think a nice compromise, so you can still have that additional speed of traversal and being able to access higher up areas and such, and not just above with something like a hookshot clawshot. To have you pulling around, zipping to different parts. Like, imagine if you were to use this for traversing mountains, the clawshot would be able to latch onto the surface of a mountain, and so you could use that to get up a lot faster. You wouldn't have to just do the slow crawling like in Breath of the Wild, but also you wouldn't be skipping the entire mountain itself by using Ascend from below or something. So I think this could be a really nice compromise, and it could also stack onto this idea of having portals or even movable time shift stones to really give us a lot more options with different types of cross-dimensional puzzles, and also help with the level design for dungeons. Which leads me to another point. We've already seen that there is a little bit of a trajectory here of how they are improving the dungeons in the open-air style of Zelda games. So Breath of the Wild changed things quite a bit with the dungeons, and a lot of Zelda fans didn't quite love those dungeons. Like, they were fine, but we're not talking about Vah Ruta being one of the greatest dungeons of all time, and I agree. I am a huge defender of the open-air Zelda games. They are the most popular Zelda games for a reason, but I do think there's a lot of room for improvement with the dungeons, and I actually think they made some significant improvement with the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom. They went back to having more of an elemental theme, or something that made them feel unique to the other dungeons in the game, and they brought back more unique epic boss fights, which are so key to the video game experience, in my opinion. In the dungeons, having an epic boss fight at the end of all these sequences, that's just how it needs to be done. That's the most satisfying, coolest way to do it. And yeah, Breath of the Wild had the bosses, but they just weren't as cool as the bosses in Tears of the Kingdom. And so I hope they continue to expand on this, and there were some dungeons that had some interesting designs, like the Lightning Temple in the desert, but then you also had dungeons like the Fire Temple, where you could just skip significant parts of it through Ascend. As I said earlier, not having abilities like Ascend could contribute to focusing on just better level design, and I think they should continue to build on that, and having things like portals or hookshots, clawshots could actually help with that as well. Like, maybe this portaling system isn't necessarily for a light world, dark world, although I hope it is. I think like how the time shift stones led to some of the best dungeons in Skyward Sword, having some variation of these cross-dimensional puzzles in modern dungeons with stronger level design could lead to some exceptional puzzles and have us thinking that these are some of the best dungeons we've seen in a very long time. And so I think they've already been moving in this direction. Even Echoes of Wisdom, they brought back a lot of that classic dungeon feel with the boss keys and such. So I think they've already been heading in this direction, and these cross-dimensional puzzles I think will certainly fit really well to have better dungeons. But something else that was sorely missed in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom was water traversal. You could travel the surface, and there would be things below to interact with. You could see them, and you could grab them, interact with them in some ways, but there's a lot more that could be done. Now, I imagine some of this had to do with the horsepower of Switch 1 or the Wii U. That would just be so much more to consider with all the complex physics and abilities involved. But on the Switch 2, it being supposedly about 10 times more powerful, they are certainly capable of handling a lot more now. And they could come up with some pretty cool water traversal puzzles and such. And so that's pretty much implied from the leak, how they talk about being able to move water into different environments. Now, maybe it isn't the case that you can go underwater, but when we have puzzles like this being described, I then have to think about that. And if we are going to have a hookshot claw shot, which we have seen works well underwater in the past, that can actually help to improve water traversal. Being able to use that to zip around to different points without having to worry too much about how you swim around slowly. And if you combo that with being able to open up portals that could have the water fall into another room, or let's say you're deep underwater and you're about to suffocate, you could use that as a quick escape, which could be very satisfying. There's a lot of cool combinations that could be had here. And perhaps there could even be moments throughout the game where they will subvert our expectations a little bit on how these abilities work. Like, say you go to a water dungeon, right? And there is this idea of there being two different realms. But what if in these two different realms, the dungeon functions very differently? Like, what if in one world, let's just call it the light world for now, it's a water dungeon, but in the dark world, it's an ice dungeon. So then you try to use your portal to transport the water elsewhere, but it does not work because on the other side, it's actually an ice dungeon. The water's frozen, so there's no way to get through. That would then lead you to think that you have to find a way to de-thaw the ice, which ultimately in most cases will likely have you leaving that room and finding another way to access the room to do that, which I think is a core component to these environmental puzzles from prior Zelda dungeons, finding these different rooms that have some sort of puzzle but you can't quite figure it out yet, and you ultimately decide that there's something you're lacking or something you have to access from a different angle or a different space. A lot of these different abilities can really figure into that. And one more point I'll bring up here, just kind of going back to the whole idea of us maybe revisiting a game that primes us for this next game. Since we're talking so much about how dungeons could be improved so much with the next game here, having us revisit something like an Ocarina of Time remake, or let's say that's wrong and we revisit a Twilight Princess HD, or maybe somehow both, these games are considered to have some of the best dungeons in series history, and so being able to play these games with really good dungeons, or perhaps even improved remixed dungeons in the case of this supposed ambitious Ocarina of Time remake, that might be another way the game could prime us for the next experience, which might delight many Zelda fans. I think if the next open-air Zelda had dungeons that were more along the lines of what we had in the past, but obviously done within this open-air format and expanded upon, I think that would make most people very happy. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.